How to play the turn when playing the button versus the big blind on dry boards. That's what we will be looking at in this video. And once again, we will be comparing the strategies for 20 big blinds, 50 big blinds and 100 big blinds to see how a strategy changes, so you can apply the knowledge in this video to other stack sizes as well and other similar boards. So let's get into it. For all the three stack sizes, we've let the button c-bet very small. If you want to know the exact strategies for the flop, then make sure to check the flop strategy video. But for now, we will be focusing on the turn, and what you can see is that for all stack sizes, 20 big blinds, 50 big blinds and 100 big blinds, the big blind is never supposed to dunk out on this run out. So we're gonna let the big blind check. Now you can see that at 20 big blinds we want to have a very mixed strategy. So we'll let the big blind check, and now the button has basically three sizes that we want to use. We barely want to use the all-in sizing, so we barely overpot jamming here. But we are betting quite often 4 big blinds, so very small, 40% of the time. And we bet 30% of the time 6.5 big blinds, and the other 29% of the time we check. If you want to get a better understanding of what hands we use for which, we can change here the info panel to button breakdowns. And now we get a nice overview of what to do with each hand strength. So with 3 of a kind, you can see we are very often either betting small, but also checking quite often. And it's very interesting to me that we are checking with 7 so often. With 2 pairs, we are mostly betting small. With top pairs, we are very often going for bigger sizing as well. Why do we want to bet the top pair bigger than the 2 pair? That's because with the 2 pair, we also block his calling range very hard. So that's why we do want to go big with our top pairs, and with the 2 pairs, which also need less protection, but more so because we block his calling range, we want to go smaller, and that way also still have a really good hands when we bet on the smaller side. Then we've got some second pairs, which we are having a fairly mixed strategy. We're still sometimes going very big with king, queen, king, jack offsuit, the king 10 offsuit. So the stronger king X, so we get at least another street of value here. We are probably not going to be able to go for 3 streets of value with those. So we want to go bigger, making sure we at least get 1 street of good value. Then with the third pairs, we're mostly checking except for the 8s to queens, which makes sense because we still want to get value against the 7x. Whereas with the 7x ourselves, once again, makes it less likely that he's got a 7. So that's why we decide to check the 7x and we bet the 8s to queens. Then with our lower pairs, so the 6s and 5s, we do not have a value bet anymore, so we are checking those. We can still bet those on the flop for value and protection. We can get called by deuce X, for example, which is not calling anymore here on the turn. And we also fold out a lot of equity, you know, getting hands like 9, 8 offsuit and stuff to fold is really nice for our hand. And then we are, of course, also having some bluffs, and you can see here a really big mix here. So we can see that we want to go bigger with the queen 8s, jack 8s and 10 8s. And if we're going to hoover over, you can see that it's actually quite mixed. I mean, we don't have any flush draws available, of course, because it's a rainbow board. We're checking our queen jacks and jack 10s, which is interesting. I think it has to do with the fact that at 20 big blinds, equity protection also becomes important. We do not want to bet a lot of hands with a lot of equity, which we then have to fold versus aggression. And also with the queen 8s and the queen 9s, we actually block more of his calling range. We block the ace 8s, the ace 9s, the 8 7s. So because of that reason, those hands are actually better bluffs than a queen jack offsuit and queen 10 offsuits. And we also don't mind having to fold those versus a raise. And the same actually applies for all those 6x combinations that you see, where we block the ace 6, where we block the 7 6. So those are actually better hands that we can use as a bluff. To get to know how the big blind is supposed to respond versus a double barrel here, we are gonna let the button bet small here. Let's just say we go for a 4 big blind bet, which is the highest frequency action here at 40%. We can see that versus such a small sizing, he is supposed to start folding a lot of deuce X. He's actually supposed to continue with quite some 7x. So those 7x and 6x combinations that we mentioned before, where we block more of his 7x, is actually really good because it makes it less likely he has a 7 and more likely he has a hand like deuce X or king X or ace X. Ace X, king X, he's never folding, but makes more likely he's got those deuce X combinations. Now let's see how that changes if we let the button bet big instead of the smaller sizing. So we're going to let the button bet 6.5 big blinds. And now you can see that the big blind is supposed to fold much more. Versus smaller sizing it was around 30% and now it's 42.3%. And you can see versus the bigger sizing, the big blind is supposed to start folding some 7x. What you can see as well is that it wants to fold more of the higher deuce X and it wants to call more of the lower deuce X. And this has to do with how our bluffing range looks like. As we saw, we want to continue with our queen 8s, with our queen 6s. Also our jack sixes. With those hands, he actually bluffs those with those jack deuce, queen deuce, 10 deuce, etc. And he unblocks those bluffs with the lower deuce six. Hence why he wants to rather call those than the higher deuce six. So the relative hand strength is here not as important. Blockers are more important. What we can see as well is that versus a bigger sizing, the big blind wants to start jamming 8% of the time. What hands is he jamming? It's mostly starting to fast play some of his a6, making sure that he gets max value with those. Same for the 7 deuce, and then some of the bluffs that he wants to use are some of the deuce 6 combinations where he blocks our sets and where he blocks our 2 pairs. And if the button did bet smaller, you can see that the raising frequency for the big blind actually goes up to 12%, once again using fairly similar hands that it uses as a raise. Still the better ace x that it wants to start running for value, and the bluffs are also fairly similar with the deuce 6, and at a very low frequency some of the gutters. Now, if the big blind does indeed jam, you can see that the button is supposed to stack off basically with all his a6 and all his king x and basically folding everything else. It's actually supposed to call some 7x, but at a very low frequency. Supposed to call, of course, the sets with the 7s. Actually supposed to call some of the 8s, and actually not the 9s, jacks, 10s, and queens. This has to do with the hands that he will use as a bluff. With the 8s, with the 9s, we block some of his ace 9s and ace 8s. He doesn't have the ace queens, ace jacks, ace 10s, because he's already raising those pre-flop or re-raising those on the flop. And that's basically how a strategy looks like for 20 big blinds. Now let's have a look how a strategy looks like for 50 big blinds. As you can see, the big blind is always supposed to check on this turn. And once again, we can see that the button wants to have a mixed strategy here on the turn. It is betting 4.4 big blinds almost 19% of the time, 8 big blinds almost 20% of the time, but it's also starting to do some overputting here 12% of the time. Now once again, if you want to get a better understanding of how that looks like in terms of hands, we can change here the info panel to the button breakdown. We can see with our 3 of a kind, we're mostly having a mixed strategy. With our aces and kings, we're either checking or betting small because we massively block his calling range. And then with the 7s and deuces, where we unblock his calling range, we actually want to go very big. Pretty much the same applies for the 2 pairs, where we are either going smaller with the a7s, where we once again block more of his calling range. With the king 7s, where we unblock the a6, we want to go bigger. Then when we look at our top pairs, our strongest a6, we're going very big. Our weaker top pairs, we are checking also at a very high frequency, but if we do bet, we're gonna go big. Our second pairs, checking at a very high frequency. Our strongest king x, we still want to, just like we saw at the 20 big blinds, our king queens, we still want to get one big street of value here. And then also our weaker king x, we can still go a little bit smaller for thinner value. And then with the third pairs, we're mostly checking or once again going for very thin value with the queen 7s, some jacks, some 10s. Lower pairs, we're mostly checking, some jack deuce. I assume we are starting to turn those into a bluff there, where we block his sets, where we block his 2 pairs. And then our bluffs that we use, once again we can see that we are mostly checking our broadways. We are starting to bluff our queen jack now more often compared to 20 big blinds. And the hands that we want to use here as a bluff are the 9-6s, the 8-6s, the 9-5s, the 8-5s, where once again we block more of his calling range with the a6 and the ace-5s. So these are actually pure bluffs, where we once again block more of his calling range, the a6s, the ace-5s. Now let's have a look how the big blind is supposed to respond versus a c-bet. So let's say we're gonna go for a smaller sizing, 4.4 big blinds. At this stack depth, you can see that the big blind is actually not check raising very aggressively, only check raising versus such a small sizing 7.4% of the time. The hands that it wants to start re-raising here, check raising, are the 2 pairs, some of the turn 2 pairs with the king deuce. It still wants to re-raise some of the better a6, and the bluffs are once again very similar compared to the 20 big blind strategy. Now let's see how that changes versus bigger sizing. Let's say we let the button bet 8.2 big blinds. As always, you can see that the check raising frequency decreases. Also here, when the big blind is going to check raise, it's going to be basically playing here for stacks. He's now having 45 big blinds. Check raising means he's going to re-raise to 26 big blinds. So basically going all in. And what you can see, it uses the turn 2 pairs there for it. And it still wants to use some of the 4-3s and 5-3s as bluffs. Now let's have a look how that changes for 100 big blinds to see the strategy there. Once again, the big blind is supposed to check basically 100% here on the flop or on the turn. What you can see at 100 big blinds is that the button wants to do a lot of checking, or when betting big. Either 8.8 big blinds or 15.2 big blinds, so actually overpotting. If we want to know what hands exactly those are, we're going to change once again the info panel to the button breakdown. We can see 3 of a kind, the aces and kings where we block the calling range. We're going to go smaller or checking. Sevens and deuces, we want to go bigger. Actually, some of the deuces we are now betting, not overpotting, but a little bit smaller. So we also have some really good hands in our smaller betting range. When we look at our 2 pairs, very similar to the 50 big blinds, going really big. And with the hands where we block his calling range massively, we want to go smaller. So you see the same trends happening here. With the 2 pairs, our strongest a6, we still want to go going big here for value. Our weaker a6, we're going to use a little bit of a smaller size and we're checking. And once again, you can always simplify the strategy. You can see here now a really big mix with the a6, ace5, ace4, ace3s. What you could say is, okay, with a6, ace5, I am always going to check. Our ace4s, ace3s, I'm always going to bet. That way you are still going to be balanced. Then with our 2 pairs, we can see we are mostly checking, still going for fin value with our strongest king x. At 50 big blinds, we could see that with the king 6, king 8, we still wanted to do some smaller betting for fin value. But at 100 big blinds, because the big blind range is actually a little bit stronger, you can see that those hands actually do not want to go for fin value anymore. And you can see this being reflected in the equities. At 100 big blinds, the equity for the big blind is 56%. And at 50 big blinds, it is 53%. So because the big blind has more equity at 100 big blinds, we're actually starting to go less often for fin value. Now let's say we're going to let the button bet big or smaller here, 8.8 big blinds, which is of course still fairly big. We can see that the check raising frequency is actually really low, only 2% here, mostly calling, only check raising some of the turn 2 pairs. Bluffs once again fairly similar with the gutters. And first the overpot, the big blind is basically never check raising, only check raising 0.11% and 0.90%, so 0.3% in total. So first the overpot, it is basically never check raising here. So as takeaways, the deeper you are, the more often you want to check. At 100 big blinds, the button is supposed to check 63% of the time. At 50 big blinds, the button is supposed to check 49% of the time. At 20 big blinds, the button is only supposed to check 29% of the time. Why is this? We can see this in the equities. 20 big blinds, big blinds only having 47% equity. 50 big blinds starts to have 53% equity. At 100 big blinds, it's starting to have 56% equity. So the deeper you are, the stronger big blinds range is on this board. And that's why we want to be continuing less often on the turn the deeper we are. As second takeaway, you want to continue big for value with hands that unblock his calling range, which you can see here with the 7s and deuces, where we unblock his aces and kings. And with the aces and kings, where we block more of his a6 and king x calls, we are either betting small or checking at a high frequency. When bluffing, it's actually reversed. When you block more of his calling range, that's when you want to bet big. And use those combinations as a bluff. As third takeaway, the deeper you are, the less fin for value you can go. At 100 big blinds, you can see that with the second pairs, we are mostly checking. At 50 big blinds, we start betting the second pairs more often. And at 20 big blinds, we are very often betting the second pairs for value. Same for the third pair. So the shorter you are, the thinner you can go for value. And as fourth takeaway, the shorter you are, the more you can check raise in the big blind. At 20 big blinds versus a big sizing, we check raising 8% of the time. At 50 big blinds, we only check raising 3% of the time versus a bigger sizing. At 100 big blinds, it's also very low. So the shorter you are, the more hands you can check raise and go all in, because also at the shorter stack sizes, you know that the button is continuing thinner for value, which allows you to also check raise thinner for value. I hope this video has given you a better understanding of how to play the turn button versus the big blind on these dry boards. If you liked the video, make sure to like it and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos.